The future they promised humanity had an expiration date. If this story stays with you until the end, it's because something here also speaks about you. To continue receiving chapters from this universe without needing to search, subscribe now. After that, just listen. Project Aurora began as a global promise and ended as a silent sentence. When the world regime announced the creation of the first generation of photosynthetic humans, the world believed it was facing a definitive solution. There would be no more hunger, there would be no more energy misery, there would be no more dependence on unstable production chains. Bodies capable of converting light into sustenance seemed like the absolute end of scarcity. Corporations called it a humanitarian advance. Governments called it social balance. Ordinary people called it hope. They were called auroras, not because they glowed, but because they symbolized a new dawn for the human species. They were born like any child. They cried, slept, learned to walk. They had no leaves on their skin nor translucent eyes. The difference was in the invisible. Each cell carried artificial structures capable of converting sunlight into vital energy. A few hours under the sun supplied needs that previously required entire systems of production, transport, and control. Eating became optional, working to survive unnecessary. Dr. Helena Vasconcelos was present from the beginning. Her name appeared in the founding documents of Project Aurora, in the initial genetic codes, in the simulations that promised stability for centuries. She believed in what she did with almost spiritual conviction. For her, it was not just science, but historical redemption. For the first time, humanity would not need to exploit itself to continue existing. When she became pregnant, Helena did not hesitate. She authorized the full integration of the photosynthetic protocol. Her son would not just be part of the future, he would be the future. Miguel grew up under light. From an early age, his body responded to the sun instinctively. He knew when he needed to go outside, when it was enough, when energy flowed in fullness. While other children learned schedules, meals, and limits, Miguel learned to observe the sky. At 5 years old, he understood he was different. At 10, he understood that this made him special. At 15, he began to realize that it also made him dangerous. The auroras did not buy food. They did not pay energy bills. They did not depend on logistical chains. They did not go into debt. Each one of them was a small, silent rupture in the global economic system. The regime claimed that this was the goal. Corporations knew it was a structural threat. From the beginning, there was an immutable rule. The auroras died at 18 years old. The official explanation spoke of late instability of the photosynthetic system, an inevitable collapse after complete cellular maturation. The media repeated the discourse naturally. The regime called it a sacrifice necessary for the collective good, an acceptable price for global stability. Helena called it a lie. She began to suspect when Miguel's exams at 17 showed a body far too healthy for someone condemned. No sign of progressive degradation, no organic failure, no functional loss. It was as if something were simply waiting for a specific moment. She analyzed old data, cross-referenced reports, ignored warnings. She realized that all auroras died exactly on the day of their birthday, not before, not after. There was no statistical margin of error, no acceptable biological variation. It was a timed event. When she accessed restricted files, Helena crossed an irreversible boundary. She broke layers of security that she herself had helped design. She found lines of genetic code that had never been disclosed, a temporal trigger, a definitive command, activated at the instant the body completed 18 years of existence. The auroras did not die from failure, they died by design. The regime never intended them to live long enough to question the world they had inherited. Children do not organize revolutions. Adolescents do not overthrow systems. Adults question. Adults resist. Project Aurora was never the future of humanity. It was a containment mechanism to create a generation capable of absorbing immediate crises without ever reaching political maturity. Self-sufficient bodies, disposable minds, a temporary solution disguised as an eternal utopia. Miguel did not discover the truth through files or codes. He realized it through silence. His friends began to disappear. There were no funerals, no collective mourning, only cold statements and new births announced in the same week. The cycle needed to continue without emotional interruptions. On a night when the artificial light of the apartment simulated a perfect sunset, Miguel asked his mother if he was going to die. Helena lied. It was the last time. In the following days, Helena tried everything: reversion protocols, genetic overwriting, interruption of the temporal trigger. Nothing worked. The code was distributed in redundant layers, as if it had been designed to resist exactly that kind of attempt. The regime noticed. Agents arrived before the birthday. The escape was useless. The modern world no longer had enough shadows. Satellites tracked thermal patterns, urban systems controlled light, the sun itself was monitored. Miguel turned 18 in a white room. There was no pain, just the sensation of something essential being turned off. Helena held his hand until the end. The final report declared success. Months later, Helena leaked everything: evidence, codes, intentions. The regime called it informational terrorism. Corporations called it a threat to stability. Ordinary people called it fear. But something had changed. For the first time, someone asked why the future needed to die young. What the regime did not foresee was the side effect of the revelation. Contrary to what the strategists had calculated, the truth did not generate immediate revolt. It generated silence. A heavy, uncomfortable silence spread like fine dust over entire cities. People continued going to work, buying food, paying bills, but something had cracked inside. Because for the first time, the sacrifice had a face. The auroras stopped being numbers and reports and began to be remembered as children, adolescents, interrupted laughter. Old videos began to circulate, filmed birthdays, mundane conversations, small moments of humanity that now seemed like evidence of a perfectly organized crime. Helena was captured weeks after the leak. There was no public trial. The regime knew that courts generate stages and stages generate martyrs. She simply disappeared. Officially, there had never been a doctor with that name connected to Project Aurora. Academic records were erased. Publications attributed to other researchers. The past was rewritten with surgical efficiency. But ideas do not disappear with people. In different parts of the world, small groups began to form. They were not armed revolutionaries, nor declared movements. They were parents, teachers, technicians, people who had lived alongside auroras and were now connecting dots that previously seemed isolated. They did not shout slogans. They only asked questions. Why exactly 18 years? Why did no aurora ever survive one more day? Why were births still being encouraged despite the known deaths? The answers never came. The regime reinforced advertising campaigns, emotional videos praising youthful sacrifice as an act of collective love. They called the auroras guardians of tomorrow. They created symbolic holidays, abstract monuments, everything to keep the narrative under control. But control was no longer absolute. Among the data leaked by Helena, there was something that almost went unnoticed, a specific line of genetic code marked as contingency. It was not part of the standard protocol. It was a theoretical possibility, discarded due to ethical unviability. The possibility of an aurora surviving. Not without cost, not without consequences. The code indicated that if certain environmental and biological conditions were altered before the activation of the temporal trigger, the shutdown command could fail. It would not be a clean reversal, it would be a rupture. The body would survive, but it would never function the same way again. The information circulated in a fragmented, incomplete way. Even so, it was enough. In a distant suburb, a woman named Sophia watched her son sleep under the weak light of an old lamp. Tomas was 17 and was also in Aurora. She was not a scientist, she did not understand genetic codes, but she understood loss. She had already buried a nephew, a neighbor, 2 students from the school where she worked. She decided she would not accept the script. Sophia began to alter small details of Tomas's routine. Less direct solar exposure, more unstable artificial light, environments with electromagnetic interference. None of this had a clear scientific basis. It was desperation disguised as an attempt. Others did the same, each in their own way. Some failed. Others disappeared before trying. And then, on a silent dawn, an aurora did not die. The birthday passed. No collapse. No shutdown. Tomas woke up the next day feeling pain, real hunger for the first time in his life, a deep exhaustion. His body had lost photosynthetic efficiency almost completely, but he was alive. The news did not spread quickly. It was whispered, confirmed with fear, passed on in improvised codes. An adult aurora existed. The regime reacted as it always had in face of existential threats: denial, then force. Helena and Tomas fled before the agents arrived. There were no more safe networks. There were no invisible places. Only constant movement, secondary cities, forgotten zones, regions where the sun barely touched the ground because of permanent pollution. Tomas grew differently, not just in age, but in consciousness. He carried the memory of all those who did not get there. Each step was heavy with the weight of the absent. The world, slowly, began to change, not because the regime fell, not because corporations lost power, but because the central lie had been exposed, and exposed lies never returned to their original size. People began to question other promises, other perfect solutions, other futures packaged as inevitable. Project Aurora officially continued to exist, but births decreased, adherence fell, parents began to refuse. The future stopped seeming free. Somewhere that would never be recorded, Tomas stood in front of the rising sun. He still needed light, but now he also needed food, rest, time. He was living proof that design could be broken, and that was more dangerous than any armed revolution. Because totalitarian systems survive violence, but they rarely survive possibility. If you made it this far, understand, this story does not speak only of fiction. It speaks of every time the future is promised with hidden conditions. If you want to continue exploring this universe and the next developments of this fractured humanity, subscribe. The next chapter has already begun.